Hey guys, welcome back to another Kubernetes video. Today I'll be talking about Kubernetes security. This will be an introduction to a series that I will be doing, and this video is really just to summarize what future videos will contain and start to develop a little bit of familiarity to some of the concepts that I'll be going over. So let's jump straight into things. So what are some of the security concerns that we will have in our Kubernetes cluster? Well, the first concern will be around node security, and this is it's kind of a separate topic to security within Kubernetes itself, and really it is universal to any kind of virtual machine security that you may already be aware of. So things like disabling root access, these are generally best practices when it comes to setting up our Kubernetes cluster and our nodes specifically. And we want to go with SSH key based authentication, generally speaking. The second area of concern is around the API server, and this is where a lot of the content will come from as we move through this series. And really we're looking to limit who can access the API server. We're looking to limit what they can do, and then we're looking to encrypt communication to and from the API server. Because when you think about vulnerability in a Kubernetes cluster, the API server is that point of vulnerability. If we had a totally exposed API server, anyone could go and do anything they wanted to our cluster, gather any information they wanted about our cluster or the workloads running inside it. So this is where we have to be extremely careful when it comes to how we set up authorization, authentication, and our communication encryption. So in terms of authentication and who can access our cluster, there are a few ways of doing it. The first one is using usernames and passwords. We could also use certificates. Thirdly, we could use external authentication providers. For example, we could use LDAP, which stands for Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. I'm not going to go into the details of each of these individual mechanisms and their pros and cons in this video. These are just this is just to give a very brief overview of our options. And finally, we can use service accounts to authenticate, and this is what we use when we are trying to authenticate essentially non-human users. So the first three we can use for authenticating individuals who want to access the API server. And for service accounts, these are to allow, for example, pods to access other pods or other resources within a cluster. For example, I believe in our last video we talked about how the cloud controller manager might need to have access to nodes, so we would set up a service account for the cloud controller manager, and that service account would be given permissions to access the node. And speaking of the permissions, and this is where we define what users can actually do within the cluster. So there are a few different authorization methods. The first one is RBAC, which is role-based access control, and this is the most predominant method of authorization that you will see in Kubernetes, and you'll probably, as you work with Kubernetes more, you'll become more and more familiar with it. Then we have ABAC, which stands for attribute-based access control, and this allows us to set policies based on attributes of particular users. Then there is node authorization, and this is a way to grant kubelets access based on the pods that they are scheduled to run. So if a certain kubelet has a particular workload that it needs to run, that workload may have particular requirements in terms of setting up different resources or accessing those resources. in which case we can use authorization, node authorization, to facilitate that kind of a scenario. And finally, there is webhook mode, and this is where we set up an external web endpoint to be a provider in terms of giving us the information that determines what a particular user can do within our cluster. And the final consideration when we're talking about securing the Kube API server is communication. And essentially what we're looking to do here is encrypt the traffic using transport layer security. We can also limit the traffic between different components using network policies. So for example, if we only want a certain subset of pods to be able to communicate with each other, we can implement network policies to achieve that. And that's one other way of restricting communication. Encryption obviously isn't going to restrict communication, it's just going to make sure that if someone were to intercept our traffic, they wouldn't be able to read that traffic and understand what's being sent back and forth. So this has been our very brief introduction to security in Kubernetes. There will be a lot more to come. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. Please like and subscribe, and I'll talk to you in the next video.